Hello. Okay, so today we're going to be rewinding ourselves back to Sheffield in the industrial north of England in the late 1970s. Punk had kind of burst through and in the sort of mid to late 70s, and dance music was kind of not really, well, as we know it, electronic dance music hadn't really happened yet. And Cabaret Voltaire, of whom Stephen Mallinder was a founding member, started making electronic music. They went on to go to New York and work with Arthur Baker and Africa Bambaataa, and then also went to Chicago in the 1980s to record with Chicago house folks like Marshall Jefferson and Ten City. So we're going to start by talking about what was happening musically around you when you started the band.
Well, that's quite loud, isn't it? Morning, everyone. Hope you're all right. Everyone's looking a little bit frazzled. Nice to meet you all. Thank you. Aha, headphones. We'll get by. Thank you very much indeed. When we started making music, which was about 72, 73, well, no, it wasn't really music. We weren't really into it because the type of music that really existed at that time was very much, the chart music was very kind of pompous. And I would imagine bands that were around at that time were, you know, Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and that kind of music, Queen or whatever, that came from that period. So there wasn't a tremendous amount that we were into. Rich and myself had known each other since we were about 12, 13 years old, and we were actually skinheads. We met at football matches, and we were kind of soul boys. So we used to go to all the soul clubs when we were about 13, 14. So our actual grounding in music was sort of black music. We were both working class kids and grew up with that. And anything else that was kind of in our own world at that moment didn't really matter to us. So, but we were kind of around that time. I suppose the tail end of music that was interesting was stuff like Roxy Music, Bowie, people like that, because the glam rock stuff was kind of interesting to us. And broke that mould. So we went from sort of being soul boys but being interested in different kinds of music, and people like Brian Eno were a massive influence on us because they were actually integrating things that were he was integrating things that were non-musical, and that kind of appealed to us. We didn't want to be musicians. The idea of being technically proficient or learning a traditional instrument was kind of an anathema to us.
So you, the band, kind of you kind of came together at a point where mainstream music was pretty pompous, pretty boring, pretty mainstream, but there were these artists coming around the outside like Bowie and Brian Eno who were doing stuff, and Roxy Music, who were doing stuff that was interesting to you. Yeah,
I mean, and the fact that Eno was a non-musician, he was playing a Revox, he was playing a VCS3 within a kind of rock format, and so we weren't that interested in the musical side so much. We were more interested in Eno's side. But yeah, I mean, we were 16, 17 years old, so, you know, and Roxy at that moment in time, if you lived in England, and when they first appeared on Top of the Pops, and it's like they fucking landed from Mars, they did look completely different, very different. So that kind of appealed to us. And when you're that age, you know, you're interested more exploring the kind of margins rather than the mainstream. So that's how we got into it.
I definitely at some point want to take you back to this kind of 13-year-old, 14-year-old boy hanging out in soul clubs in Sheffield, which is an interesting parallel to what we had yesterday with Scream. You know, that whole thing about being really young and getting into music definitely gives you a certain edge when you're making stuff. But before we talk about that, you just mentioned something about musicianship being anathema to you, that your way of doing things wasn't about having to be proficient at piano. It was about something different. So this is kind of like the punk DIY ethic, isn't it? The idea that you don't need to have had piano lessons all your life to be a musician.
We did once play, I mean, but this was back about 4 or 5 years before punk happened. We did actually find a piano, but in true kind of anti-art tradition, we didn't actually play it. We mic'd it up with contact mics and then smashed it to pieces with a sledgehammer. And recorded it, and we used that for about 3 years. We'd go by. I mean, it was an extreme version of John Cage's prepared piano, but we kind of completely destroyed it. We didn't prepare it; we just fucking demolished it. So that's what we were into. Because the other side of it was, we were fascinated by the whole Dada thing. Obviously, that's where our name came from.
So can you explain maybe, can you just kind of give us a brief background on, because the band Cabaret Voltaire took their name from a Dadaist nightclub in Zurich, right?
Yep.
So what is Dada?
Well, Dada kind of came just around the First World War, and it was really, I guess, an art movement that really kind of held itself up against the pomposity of, at that time, as they saw the traditional art world, galleries, etc., and against kind of a bourgeois ethic that went in with art. And so we saw massive parallels with us and what we were listening to and seeing in music and what we wanted to do. So it was an easy fit, you know. It was probably quite a primitive way of doing it and taking the name literally, but when, you know, we weren't that old, and so it seemed an obvious thing to us. I mean, and particularly nowadays, people know about Dada through surrealism, etc., but not many people were aware of it. You know, we live in a knowledge society, so it's kind of quite a well-known thing there. But at that moment in time, in the 70s, people weren't really that aware of it outside traditional art circles anyway, so plagiarising that seemed quite appropriate to us.
So how did the band start?
We started literally taking that Eno ethic. We just used to buy tape recorders. We used to make tape loops. We got shitloads of tape recorders, and we used to have to lug them up to this attic, which was a pain in the arse, because some of the tape recorders you used to get then. Remember that it's interesting, electronic music at that moment in time.
So we're talking 78, 1978?
No, this is before then. This is about 73, 74 when we first started. And if you wanted a tape recorder, you used to go to these kind of trade magazines called Exchange and Mart in England, and basically they were old government machines, ex-World War II military stuff, and you'd buy them for like £5, and they weighed about 2 ton. They were fucking massive things.
So what did these things look like?
They were like big lumps of metal, you know. They were like enormous kind of industrial-looking tape machines, and we used to get all things like that, because that's where electronic music really came from. People now look at it in terms of, you know, Robert Moog, etc., theremin, but a lot of electronic music and the stuff we were doing is actually, it came from Second World War technology. It came from the whole notion that the Second World War, obviously, wars do crap things, but they do sort of accelerate certain aspects of technology. And so we were picking up things that really were probably used in the war, and we got these, you know, really 20, 30-year-old machines and lugged them up into an attic and made tape loops and things like that.
Now, that's an interesting idea, isn't it? War as a motor of modern music.
Yeah, completely. But it is, you know, I mean...
I suppose war invented the internet, really, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Kraftwerk are a result of a German kind of culture that's come from a post-war period. So you've got to remember, electronic music is quite affected culturally by those things, and we were as well, you know.
So basically, there's you and your friend Richard H Kirk, who kind of went on to record electronic music with Warp Records, as Sweet Exorcist, among other things. So there's you and him, you're teenagers, you're living in Sheffield, pretty grimy town in the north of England. And
ooh, you make it sound so nice.
it's a great place. And you decide you want to make music with this art aesthetic. So you decide to buy kind of job lots of tape machines. What did you start doing with them?
What we actually used to use the tape machines partly for loops, partly for tape delay as well, because this is the time before echo machines, which is just so commonplace now. But at that moment in time, you used to use sound on sound and use tape machines for tape delay. So we used to use them for that. Chris, who was the third member of the band at that time, he left earlier on in the piece, but Chris was an electronics guy. That was his job, and he built a synth for us. So our first synth was one he actually built, and we used to make things ourselves. So it was a DIY aesthetic. It wasn't something that you went down to a shop and bought. It was actually something, you know, it was, you know, we were just corrupting hardware that was actually there in our everyday lives to make music or make sounds.
So were you kind of actively trying to make music like someone, sort of in the early period where you're sort of working out what your sound is? Was there someone who you were kind of trying to emulate?
No, I think we literally wanted to annoy. In the very first instance, we wanted to actually use sound almost like a weapon. We found it sort of the shock of things that would take sounds taken out of context that fascinated us. I mean, we used to be sort of doing sort of mad sort of situationist stuff. You know, we'd construct tape loops and have them on tape machines and just go into shops and play them and go to people who are queuing at bus stops and we just blast them with tape loops and things like that. We were fucking bored, you know. You lived in Sheffield, like you said, it's a great industrial town. You make your own entertainment, particularly at that moment in time.
I mean, it's funny because that's something that the KLF kind of did very well in the 90s, but what kind of, you know, give us an example. What happened when you went and stood on the bus stop and played tape loops to bemused people?
People just used to think we were freaks. We actually went on the BBC really early on in about the 70s, and they just thought we were complete lunatics. So, but that's where we came from, and there was no outlet for that kind of music. I mean, I think one of the first things we ever did, because we used to make films as well, and we used to do collages and everything like that. So one of the first things we ever did, we did a performance piece for the Edinburgh Festival, and we couldn't afford to go, so we sent a tape up that they had to play. There was a Super 8 film that they showed. There was collage kind of material that went with it, so it was like a whole performance package. We created a performance package. There were instructions to super glue people to the seats, but they didn't do it.
Now, there's something I'm a little bit confused about, or maybe I haven't quite got the link. How did you go from being sort of 14-year-old soul boys on the terraces at football matches to being heavily into quite avant-garde art and music? How did that happen?
I don't know, really. I mean, Richard went to art college. I was, by that time, 74. Yeah, I mean, I was studying philosophy and politics. So we got that other side where we were pretty working class, but, and we were, you know, Richard's dad was, you know, kind of high up in the Communist Party. We were actually we were from that background, but we also, you know, the notion that, you know, working class people are thick and they don't want to do anything, we hated that. So we quite liked the idea that we could be kind of sound terrorists as well. So I guess it was just a growing up thing. So we did that. Well, we never lost our interest in popular music. So I guess we just morphed into that as an age thing as we were doing it, really.
I mean, there is a funny thing, and there is an interesting thing about class and British music, and that idea that working class kids are thick and don't want to do anything is still pervasive now. You can see that in all sorts of artists, but there seems, I don't know, it's probably not the right place to talk about it, but I think it's an interesting thing for another conversation about the way that has influenced British music, because it's really a lot of the most interesting things that have happened have been the kids who aren't supposed to be doing well, who aren't supposed to be doing anything, who've gone on to do quite incredible music. Yeah,
and I think there's a belief through class that people then automatically just move to a populist form, and that's the only thing that satisfies them. Mass music for a mass culture, but it's not always the way. But yeah.
So basically, the missing link between the kind of, you know, skinhead terrorist soul boys and your kind of situationist people who are blasting people at bus stops with music is the fact that you went to art college and university. So it was basically kind of during your student days that you started doing this kind of stuff.
I think we were just interested in things. I think anyone, as they grow through life, I mean, all these guys here, wherever you come from, you're all here because you're interested in things. You want to find out more. We wanted to know more. And to be fair, you know, people like Eno and Bowie, when we were at that stage, that turned us on to William Burroughs, Brian Gysin. You got into John Cage, you got into all that kind of stuff, Cornelius Cardew, etc. So that was a window to a whole of the world. And for a brief while, we were actually associated with quite serious sort of avant-garde musicians, you know, who came from the whole Stockhausen sort of John Cage era. And we were quite involved in that, but we kind of got booted out of that because we did a performance when we were completely drunk. And we were ostracised by these serious... So we didn't fit anywhere. These serious avant-garde musicians, this music society, the French composer that we did a thing for, we were kind of ostracised because we turned up and did a performance blind drunk. So, you know, we sort of... We quite like the idea of not fitting in anywhere, so that's where you just make your own space, and that's all we were doing.
So let's bring this up to your first release. I mean, interestingly, you had the first release on Factory Records, very influential.
No, that was the second one, actually, yeah.
Okay. So an early release on Factory Records that went on to release records by New Order, among other people, and also Rough Trade, the kind of the original British independent music label. So let's talk a little bit about those records.
Well, the first one was on Rough Trade. We were the first actual domestic release on Rough Trade. They brought out Augustus Pablo, Mr. Basie, they'd licensed that from Jamaica, and they licensed an EP by a French punk band called Metallo Urbain, who were like a punk band with a drum machine, which I thought were really good actually. And then we were the actual first release that Rough Trade actually had, which was extended play. So I think we've been kind of forgotten in the mists of time, but we were actually the first domestic release on Rough Trade. That happened. Well, I guess the thing that the link there was punk happened, and even though we weren't a punk band, it did open doors and it did give us context for what we were doing. So we started playing around those and that time. So we started to be able to play gigs, and that's what happened. We had a lot of support from a lot of those people, like Richard Boone, who was the Buzzcocks manager, New Hormans. I mean, we did the Buzzcocks tour, we did the Banshees tour. We got thrown off the Banshees tour.
So why did you get thrown off a tour with the Banshees?
We were too difficult. It was too hard. I mean, it was just a practical thing. It was like, because we were making music, or actually just doing stuff in a live way that wasn't, people weren't used to. I mean, people now can rock up with a laptop and do whatever they want to do and integrate it with, live instruments. But at that moment in time, sound engineers didn't. They were like, "Where's your drum kit?" We haven't got a drum kit. "Where's your bass cabinet?" We haven't got a bass cabinet. We just DI it. And they were like, "Oh, fuck you, we don't understand this." So I think that's why we got kicked off. Maybe we just got kicked off because we were crap. We actually shared that tour with the Human League, and they did a few more dates than we did. So.
Okay, so we can imagine what the Human League looked like on stage when they're touring with you. But what about, so you're saying, you didn't have drum kit and you didn't have this. What did you have on stage? We had,
we used to use cassettes, and we used to prepare loops and actually make specific cassettes. Our rhythm was based around tapes, so we used to use those as drum tracks, and we construct those from various things. We did have about 2 drum machines that we used live. We did use bass. Richard played guitar, and Chris played keyboards, but we processed a lot of it as well. And I used to have a primitive vocoder that I used to sort of do vocals through. So, I mean, nowadays it probably wouldn't seem that bizarre, but at that moment in time it actually did, yeah.
So this is late 70s?
Yeah, this is about 70. Well, the first EP came out in 78, so that was... And, I mean, by that time we'd had a fair number of things written about us. John Savage was probably instrumental in a lot of things. John Savage, who, I don't know if these guys know, but I mean, a famous writer in England, wrote England's Dreaming and did a lot of stuff. But John was very supportive, and so he was the one who actually got us the deal with Rough Trade. He just badgered Jeff and said, "Oh, you should bring out, the cab stuff," and so that's why we did it. Yeah.
Well, should we have a listen to something from this era? From this
yeah, we should actually. Well, that's Nag Nag Nag, isn't it? So yeah, play that.
Okay, so we've got Nag Nag Nag, which actually, interestingly, went on to, in the same way that you took your name from a nightclub in Zurich, was taken by a nightclub in London in sort of about 2001,
yeah.
Which kind of pioneered a sort of, again, a quite avant type of bizarre nightclub music. But anyway, let's listen to this.
Oh. What shows it on this one?
So what kind of reaction did you get from people when you rolled up on stage doing this kind of thing?
So strangely enough, by this time we probably were less sort of well, not less confrontational, but we kind of, I guess we put it in a space that was more acceptable in terms of performance and things like that. And that particular track was done more of a joke actually than anything else, because it's a complete rip-off of a Seeds track. On the first album, we did a cover of a Seeds track. The Seeds being a '60s sort of California garage band, and it was it's a real straightforward sort of verse chorus, and we didn't want to bring out the Seeds track as a single, so we went, oh, we'll do our own version of No Escape. So we did, and so we went into Berry Street and recorded that with Jeff. But it was actually done really to go, well, that was probably the most accessible thing on the album, but we never believed in bringing singles from albums at that point, so we just went and recorded that, and it was just more of a lift from a kind of a 60s kind of garage sound. And again, that's very contextualised by punk in the sense that really was done at that moment in time, because that really I suppose, angled our kind of stuff into what was going on in the music at the scene at that time.
I mean, there's a story that seems to have passed into urban legend about you being dragged off stage by disco fans and beaten up because they didn't like what you were doing.
That sounds really naff, doesn't it, getting dragged off stage by...
What happened?
They were actually... The funny thing was, they were actually... This is what's even weirder. They were actually environmentalists. No, that was way before this. That was about 1975, and these people who were like the equivalent of Friends of the Earth, and they were having a fundraiser, and they just said they wanted a band. And I don't know, it wasn't me, it was Chris, and Chris must have known one of them, and he said, "You've got a band, haven't you?" And Chris went, "Yeah," and he went, "What? Can you play disco? Can you play funk?" "Yeah, of course we can play disco, we can play funk." And we turned up playing tape loops of Sledgehammers and things like this, and they got really pissed off because more because we'd said we could play anything. "Oh yeah, we can play disco," you know. So, and they went, "No, you can't play disco." And all these environmentalists then, I guess they showed their true colours. And yeah, there was a big fight, and I got pushed off stage by a couple of people, and just, you know, it's one of those things. We didn't mind. We were quite happy to annoy people. Like I said, that was before this period. So it was the first gig I think we did, but we were just happy to annoy people. So the consequences of pissing people off is sometimes you get battered for it, really.
So I just wanted to just take it back a minute for this thing about releasing records on independent labels. How important was that to you to be working with independents rather than major labels?
Well, firstly, a major label would never have taken us anyway, and we certainly wouldn't have wanted or been capable of kind of adapting what we wanted for, you know, what we were doing for commercial kind of purposes in that sense. And yeah, it was important, you know, that whole independent thing, even though there's been a massive history of independent labels through soul, etc. At that moment in time, it was kind of representative of the music culture in Britain. So, and we were really lucky. We did stuff with Rough Trade, the early stuff, and we did albums for them. And then we were on the first Factory record as well, the Factory sampler. And again, it was just because we wanted to work. You wanted to work with people who were associates, just like these guys. You know, you work within a kind of a supportive environment. And I don't think we would have ever felt that signing it initially at that moment to EMI or wherever would have been sympathetic. So you worked with people who who were supportive of you, and people like Tony Wilson and all those guys wanted to do it. So you were kind of pushing against a whole culture and a whole industry, and that's what you wanted to do. So we were quite happy to do that.
I mean, you just mentioned Tony Wilson there, who ran Factory Records and opened the Hacienda in Manchester. Where did if you're thinking about that kind of period, where does Cabaret Voltaire fit into Manchester music, which kind of went on to, again, massively influence dance music and everything that happened since?
Well, because, I mean, where we were from was only 50 miles from Manchester, so even from being, kind of quite a kid, we used to go over, and Rich and I used to go over to clubs in Manchester when we were really young. So it's really... I'll tell you that Manchester's just a suburb of Sheffield, and people from Manchester will tell you the reverse. So it's not that dissimilar. And so we were always going over and playing. We played the Russell Club loads of times. We toured loads with Joy Division. We played a lot with Joy Division. And then, so we were just part of that whole thing. The only reason we didn't do an album for Factory was because when we were getting ready to do the album, Tony didn't have enough money, and Jeff did. So it was whoever had the money to bring it out. So we'd done one release on Factory, one on Rough Trade, and then Rough Trade were able to bring the album out. So we did Nag 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 and the album with them, just because Tony was kind of strapped for cash, and then they put their money into Unknown Pleasures, and Joy Division did their album instead. So it all worked out really nicely. So,
as we all probably know, Joy Division went on to become New Order. What was it like touring with Joy Division?
It was fucking hilarious, No, Ian was a lovely guy, and they were all great people, and we kind of were friends with New Order for a long time, and again, it's just a community. It's a music community. I guess people now see New Order or Joy Division as these iconic acts, but for us, they were just people who we knew. I was big friends of the Ratios and all that. So it was just, I suppose the thing is that music now has expanded so much that there are so many pockets of music in so many areas. But at that moment in time, there probably weren't as many bands around and there weren't as many people making music. So you naturally kind of gravitated towards each other. You naturally did gigs together and you gradually, you naturally knew each other, really.
I mean, that's quite an interesting thing talking about. In those days, it was much harder to be into music, wasn't it? You had to really put graft in and effort in to find music that you were into. So what was that like then? If say, for example, the music you were into when you were younger, what did you have to do to get the records?
Well, I mean, I guess with soul music, it was something unless you were a collector, and I wasn't a collector, it's not something you consumed in that way. You consumed, but you listened to it. It was something that we didn't buy as much of, and we were young. We didn't have any money. We didn't have disposable income like people do now. So, a lot of the soul stuff was just something that you were part of that culture, but you weren't, as people are now, collectors of it and consumers of it in that way.
So you wouldn't actually buy the records, you would just
No, we just used
to
go to all the clubs. I mean, we were like 13, 14, 15 years old. I mean, I got caught. I mean, to be fair, I got busted a few times for shoplifting. I got caught stealing Prince Buster records because I couldn't afford to buy them. I feel really bad about that now because, respect to Prince Buster, but it's the only way I could get the records at that time. And there were only 1 or 2 record shops that would do that. I mean, now with eBay and importers, etc., people can buy that stuff so easily. In the early 70s, there was only 2 or 3 shops where you could get that from. So you used to steal them sometimes if you couldn't get them, Stealing's bad, so don't do it, but, that's what I did then.
I think that sort of, that whole idea about, like, putting in or getting out what you put in has to have some impact on the music, because obviously, in many ways, it's brilliant to be able to, like, if you suddenly decide you're into reggae, to be able to go and download, as much Prince Buster or as much King Tubby or as much of whatever you want, at the press of a button. But there's something that you gain from having to put effort in, surely.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I'm sure a lot of guys here are diggers. I mean, I'm sure the thrill is finding something that isn't as accessible. People like to search for things. People, we invest a lot in music and emotionally, and so therefore and we want to feel a connection with it. And sometimes the fact that music is incredibly accessible, I'm not saying it's not special, but it's a lot nicer for you if you can actually make that effort. You make that effort, you find something, you've got that connection, and so what you've invested in it is returned. And it's elitist in some ways, but music's driven by people who are searching on a separate path. So it's it's part of it, really.
So what do you think about the whole sort of iTunes nation that we're all living in now, where you can download everything whenever you want? Everything is accessible. You can cherry pick music from all eras of music and from all types of music. What do you think? You think that's okay? Or
we're gluttons now for it. But no, I mean, everything is accessible. Everything's there. Time doesn't really exist anymore. It's an interesting kind of space where we're at. And I certainly don't knock it, because it's just the way it is. The platforms that have arisen that we can access music from and the way we can get them is fantastic, and you can't knock it. It's just it was a different time then. But I still think people are looking to find margins. Obviously, the margins, where interesting things happen, have gradually sort of contracted. But I still think people try and find those margins to find that kind of music.
So you mean people who are interested in music are always going to look for those little spaces, the tiny sort of hidden holes where good stuff's happening?
Yeah, it's just those margins have kind of disappeared a little bit because everything's so accessible. But I still think people want to find that. They still want to look for those things, yeah.
Okay, so let's get back on the Cabaret Voltaire history train. When did you go to New York?
We actually, I mean, the funny thing was we didn't go to New York until the early 80s, I don't think. And in fact, by the time we'd gone there, I think Sensoria had kind of topped the dance charts there, and Arthur Baker, John Roby had done Yashar. So we went there after the records that we'd done had actually been successful in New York.
So you had some New York hookups before you actually went to New York. So let's kind of, ease us into this period of the band's history. What happened? How did you hook up with Arthur Baker, and how did your music start sounding more kind of obviously danceable?
Well, it kind of links into that idea of looking for margins and looking for spaces where there's interesting things happening. And we were never really musically, sonically part of the punk thing. So we didn't have any affinity particularly with that. We still kind of were very linked to a lot of kind of, I suppose, club music in that sense, a lot of reggae and everything. That's where we were interested in music. And at that moment in time, in the early 80s, in the very early 80s, that's where interesting things were happening. You know, when Planet Rock came out and all that, that's where something really different was happening, and we were always interested in that. So I think we were just naturally drawn to that, naturally drawn to electro, naturally drawn as well to the 12-inch format, because we were very much into repetition and loops and keeping things going. And all of a sudden there became a format which was more in vogue that suited those kind of things. We were never into the sort of 4-minute single. It wasn't our thing. We weren't bothered about radio play. So therefore, you want your people to access your music, and all of a sudden, there was a kind of a porthole into a sort of a world that wasn't, you know, driven by commercial kind of considerations.
So where did you first hear Planet Rock?
I can't remember actually. That's really interesting. I mean, all that Grandmaster Flash stuff. I mean, I think we just. I guess you, like everyone, you just kind of, you're interested in music and you buy it on import. And it would have been in the very early days, you know, when we found all that. And I think we were just kind of like, listening to music and just dug all that stuff out. And we just found it in the early days. And at that very same time that happened, we were kind of doing, obviously we were pushing the idea of using drum machines and using breaks and things like that. And it became reciprocal. So John Roby heard a track of ours, Yashar, and this was just as he was doing Planet Rock, and said, he just got in touch and said, I really want to do a mix of this track. And we went, yeah, all right.
Okay, so it wasn't you hearing the music and then searching out the kind of electro people in New York.
No.
It was electro people in New York heard your records and got in touch with you.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think it was, in actual fact, I think it was from Barney and Hooky and Tony, because
okay, so
New Order, yeah,
because
they were, because they knew Arthur Baker, I think, at that point. I can't remember, and they knew John Roby, and John Roby heard the track, and so we did that actual track for Factory at that moment in time. And I think it was just the sample. Roby liked the sample and said, I really want to do a mix of it.
So how did you sample back then?
I'm trying to think. That was from TV, so it was actually put down at the tape onto reel-to-reel. Everything we did was on reel-to-reel, and it was literally laid down, and we would have been using 8-track at that time. So you'd literally drop in, you know, you drop in and drop out, so you'd lay your samples like that. You know, it was very physical. It was a very kind of tactile process.
So talk us, I mean, you say it was a very physical and very tactile process to use tape in that way. What actually did you have to do?
You literally ran one machine and dropped it in on the other, and hopefully you hit the beat. And then once you'd mastered it, you'd start editing and doing, you know, chopping on the tape. And so you'd actually do tape edits. Everything we did was tape edits, and that was a massive skill in its own way. I mean, you know, sometimes you'd have a track that was, you know, 6 minutes long, and there would be hundreds of tape edits in it. You know, you'd literally be chopping it and chopping it and chopping it. You know, you might start with a track that's 20 minutes long and edit it down to a 6-minute track by cutting into it and doing it that way. So it was very physical, yeah.
And you mentioned drum machines as well. What were you using?
The main, we just used to sort of scour old music shops, because drum machines came in for, the reason they were around was because before there was satellite TV, people used to play home organs, and people used to kind of play along. It was the big thing in the sort of 70s. If you were kind of lived in the suburbs, you know, as well as your record player, you'd have a home organ, and people would play along, and they'd have rhythm machines to play along with it that played a bossa nova, and, you know, your grandma would be playing along to the bossa nova.
So this is kind of like family entertainment.
Yeah, and we used to pilfer all these drum machines. That's how we used to do it. You know, and we had loads of them at one point. You know, so we just used to use those. Those were those were our mechanisms for rhythm that we needed, that we wanted. We weren't that. We did use drummers, and we used them on all the albums, and sort of by that Yashar time we were using a live drummer anyway, a drummer and a percussionist. But there's no drummers here, is there? Because they were invariably a pain in the arse when we used a lot of drummers, so we just used to use a drum machine. Sorry guys, if you're drummers here.
Well,
I love them all actually. I'm
a
a closet drummer anyway. So
Okay, so I think it'd be good to hear the kind of the track you're talking about.
I'll dig that out.
So
Actually,
either Yashar or Sensoria.
I don't know whether Sensory is here actually. Thanks to Phil Ransom for bringing me some music down, because I think this is the John Roby. This will be interesting. So yeah.
So this is a track that.
I think this is the original mix that Roby did. I've now remembered why Roby wanted to do it, because we were at a lot of the vibe that for the track, the keyboards that we did were we used kind of Arabic scales, and he was really into it, and he thought the idea of doing something sort of with an more electro-y, even though we'd done breaks like that on it originally. That's why he was attracted to it, I think. So anyway, yeah, that's that.
So where did your music fit in the whole sort of scene that was happening in New York at the time?
I've no idea really, although it was really funny when we went and played, I think we played at the Palladium in the early 80s, and we were sound checking, and we just looked out while we were sound checking, and there was just loads of people kind of breaking to us while we were sound checking, and then we kind of realised that where we did fit into it.
So in the same way that Kraftwerk obviously were in there, Cabaret Voltaire were in there too?
Yeah, for a period it was, yeah.
So tell us about what happened when you went to New York then.
We just did gigs over there. I mean, we didn't actually record in New York. I think we did some stuff with Roby in the studio for a little while, but we worked in London with Roby. He flew over to London. I think he probably, like we sit here going, oh great, go to New York and record. He probably went, I want to go to London and record. So we did more stuff over in London with him later on. We did quite a few tracks with him over there. So we just literally went over, played and did our stuff over there. So I guess in some ways we were quite detached from what was, what effect we had. We weren't kind of living there doing it. We spent a fair amount of time in New York over a period of years, but at that moment in time we just go over, gig and come back, and that was it. And you go to clubs and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, you just mentioned sound checking at the Palladium and looking out and seeing people breakdancing to what you were doing. What other kind of what other sort of experiences did you have like that, where you suddenly sort of realised that your music was somehow kind of in the hip-hop canon?
Like I say, it's really strange. It just opened a window really, but it wasn't something that we massively exploited or anything. We were just, it was just something that was played there at that moment in time. And so we used to go and play and, go to the clubs, go to Danceteria, Mud Club or whatever. It was more of a social thing for us. We didn't go over there like some sort of ethnologist or anthropologist going, we found these interesting people in New York, I think we'll work with them. It was just, it was more organic than that. We just did stuff, we did our own shit, and they got into it.
I mean, these clubs you're talking about, Danceteria, the Palladium, were really key clubs at that time, Give us a window into what they were like. What were those clubs like?
Danceteria was really funny, actually. It's on about 4 floors. It used to have an open lift. That was always terrified I'd fucking fall down a lift shaft. I remember seeing Madonna in there when Jelly Bean was playing in there, but, it's funny, actually, because clubs are clubs. I don't... Particularly that people look back on it, obviously hindsight's this amazing thing where you go, wow, we were sort of hanging out in these clubs. But at the time it was like, let's go and have a drink, and this was the place to go, and you go down and you'd hang out, and it was fun, yeah. So
what were they playing at Danceteria in the early 80s?
I think, I can't remember when it was we were there. I think it was the time when Jelly Bean was there, but I can't remember. I mean, it was very Latin, it was very electric. It was all 808s, but coming a little bit later, it was all 808s by that time. So.
This is Jelly Bean Benitez.
Yeah.
And
but, New York was mad in those. New York in that time, in the mid-80s, was crazy, Some of the area clubs and things like that you go to, it was kind of quite mad, it was that sort of glam scene that was there. So, it's a bit odd,
Any other kind of New York nightlife moments you wish to share with us?
No, I met Andy Warhol once. It was a cliche, though. He was actually with Bianca Jagger. It's like, fucking hell. Yeah, I thought it was his stunt man. I thought he'd, oh look, Andy Warhol's standing there in a club with a standing Bianca Jagger, but it was actually him. Yeah.
And were there any other sort of New York hookups that happened for you during this time?
No, I mean, to be quite honest, we just went back and did our own thing after that. We weren't there constantly because we were based in England. We were recording, we were touring in Europe, we were gigging in around Europe and doing all that. So, no, I mean, it probably, I'm trying to think, probably the next time, we used to go back to New York a little bit, but the next time I started to get involved, I actually went to I went to New York trying to find Todd Terry. This is a little bit later, and I couldn't find him. He didn't answer his phone, so that's why we ended up in Chicago, so it links to Chicago, actually, because by the late 80s, obviously we were interested in all that. We were that was what fascinated with us, and at that moment in time, when Todd Terry had started doing some stuff, it's all that Frankie Bones period and all that, we really wanted to work with Todd Terry, but he never picked up the phone. And in the meantime, while I was there, I met up with Marshall. And then we ended up going to Chicago, a while later, a year later, and doing stuff in Chicago. So it was a strange kind of connection. So probably my New York days ended at that moment in time.
And some Chicago days started. But before we talk about that and the whole sort of late 80s house period, let's just go back a little bit, because there was a period where the music got a bit more overtly dub influenced, and you worked with Adrian Sherwood from On New Sound System.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about him.
Could I get a drink of water? Is that possible? Sorry.
I'll get it.
Adrian, how did I meet Adrian? Well, we'd actually, the stuff that we were doing kind of prior to Adrian, because we did 3 albums with Flood. Well, I don't know if you guys know Flood, U2's producer. We actually did quite a lot of work with Flood. Adrian came after that. So we did, thank you. We did quite a lot of work with Flood. Flood actually did all the Flood did a lot of that electro stuff with us, Sensoria and all those things. So that was a period when we were working there. And then the reason we worked with Adrian was we'd left Virgin. We were with Some of His Are, and managed by a guy called Steve-O, which was a crazy period of all our lives. It was brilliant, because Steve-O looked after us, Yellow, Soft Cell, the Neubauten. So that was a very kind of interesting period, and that's why you're saying, talking about New York and things like that. There was probably interesting things going on in London where I was living by that time. So
those other bands that you had the same management with, Talk.
No, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Did you do was there any sort of musical exchanges that happened between you guys?
Yeah, Dave Ball used to play. I mean, Dave from The Grid and Soft Cell. Dave and I did a band, and Dave played on some of our albums, and I played on Mark Arman's solo stuff. I played with The a couple of times, worked with Zeke Manyika because Zeke was drumming with them. So London was kind of an interesting time around then. There was a lot of things going on at that moment in time, yeah.
Have you got something you can play us from that period?
Shit. No, I don't think I have, actually. Hang on. Well, there should be something, shouldn't there? Let me find something. Talk amongst yourselves, guys. There's a Kevorkian dub which was done around that. That was a track that we did with Flood, and then Kevorkian did a mix of it. Do you want to hear that?
This is a record. What's the track called?
It's called Sex Money Freaks.
Okay, Sex Money Freaks. This is a Francois Kevorkian mix.
Yeah, it's track 10 actually. So if we can you eject that? Where's the eject? No. You got it?
No.
Oh, you got it? Cool.
So did you meet Francois Kevorkian in New York?
Yeah, we did actually. I did meet Francois. We'd worked with John Luongo, who was a DJ around that time in New York, one of the first DJs to kind of then get involved in production. And we worked with Luongo. We've met him in New York. Excuse me, I'll just. We were by this time we'd actually left. I think it's still about another 48 bars before the bass comes in, so... I actually tell a lie, that was actually a track we did with Adrian that Kevorkian mixed. Now, I mean, we wanted to work with Kevorkian because Kraftwerk worked with him, and we were big Kraftwerk fans, and we thought he's the only producer that Kraftwerk will work with. So if he's and he's literally the only person they would work with. So we went, we'd really like to meet him, and he was really cool, and he knew all our stuff, and I think Francois did about 3 mixes for us in the end over a period of about a year, yeah.
So where did you meet him?
Just met him in New York, you know, I mean, and Francois is great, he's a dude. I mean, he lived there with his family, and, you know, we just hung out and all that kind of stuff. People probably like to imagine that it's this amazingly sort of like nocturnal debauch sort of scene and all that, but no, we just kind of met Francois in a kind of social situation, and he's just a lovely guy, and it was, you know, it was great. But at that moment in time, probably not as known as he is now, but I mean, it was great for us. We were like, great, you know, so yeah, we were really happy that he'd done stuff for us.
So let's talk a bit about the kind of house stuff that you did, because it's quite interesting. You went to New York to find Todd Terry. What turned you on to Todd Terry?
I mean, I loved the very first Todd Terry stuff. I thought it was really cool, you know, and I loved the way he just jammed in those samples and things like that. And so I guess it was, at that moment in time, his very early stuff, I thought he was doing really interesting things.
What records are you talking about exactly?
I'm trying to remember, actually, the early Todd Terry stuff. I mean, all the,
Dreams.
You know, Go Bang and all that kind of stuff, yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's because, I mean, obviously, this was kind of the early days, just as Shoom and places like that were starting. And so, you know, I've been going down to Danny and Jenny's club and all that in the early days. So,
okay, so you were coming down to this is a particular club in London,
yeah,
it?
Shoom, I mean, Shoom was really where, I suppose, the acid house thing started in that sense, when they brought it all back from Ibiza and, that, you know, that whole thing. But, I mean, that was interesting enough. They always say, if the number of people who said they went to Shoom, if they did actually go to Shoom, you'd fill Wembley Arena, because you could only actually fit about 50 people in there, really, in the end. But you know, all that kind of stuff was filtering through, the early house stuff and things like that.
And that was a kind of very dark, sweaty, stroby club. Again, it was kind of
yeah, it was
a very back to basics type club, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a fitness centre, the one with the original one down near London Bridge. But I mean, that wasn't the only club. I mean, Café de Paris had been going for a while as well, and that music was starting to filter through to clubs that were actually happening in London. And the Todd Terry type stuff was there as well as the early house stuff.
So you kind of got turned on to early house music. What kind of music were you making at this point?
That kind of stuff, really. It's probably, that was around that time, so it was probably bridging into that period.
So you go to New York to find Todd Terry, because you're into what he's doing. Todd hasn't got his phone on. But you meet Marshall Jefferson instead. How?
Met him through, I'm trying to remember, can't remember the guy's name. He was head of Atlantic Records in New York. And he said, oh, Marshall's in town, you should meet him. And that's how it came about. And then Marshall, because Marshall hated flying at the time, he flew to London, we had some meetings, and we kind of sorted out. It took about a year, I think, nearly to sort out in the end. And then we did some basic pre-production stuff, and then went to Chicago and lived in Chicago for about a month and worked with Marshall and all the guys over there.
So who exactly are the guys you're talking about? Who did you
I mean, that was like a little clique of a lot of people. So, I mean, 10 City, Kim Mazel, because they were all managed by the sort of same guy. I mean, Paris Brightledge was on that album, who worked with Sterling Boyd. You know, Little Louis, not Vega, the other Little Louis, people like that. So, you know, we just sort of spent quite a bit of time there in the middle of winter, and it was freezing, but it was fun. And Marshall is a dude, you know, he's such a great guy.
He's a funny guy. So did you sample kind of the infamous Chicago nightlife of this period? Yeah,
I mean, it was too cold to go out too often, but yeah, we went to clubs that Little Louis was doing and things like that. But it was we go out with Sleazy D and all that, Mike Dunn and all those guys. But it's kind of interesting because we were English and we were white, and it was an entirely black, you know, sort of culture, really. So it was fun, and people were lovely to us, and it was great. We had a great time, yeah.
I mean, a lot of those records still sound insane now. If you listen to Sleazy D, I've Lost Control, you know, they're just crazy records. They must have sounded incredible on big sound systems in the kind of warehouse parties that were happening there.
Yeah, I mean, I remember my fond memory is actually, that's stuck in my head, is actually going to a club where Little Louis was playing, and he did play a version of his own, because they play their own versions, and he did play a version of French Kiss that would have gone on for about 20 minutes with trains and aeroplanes and everything going through on really fucking, like a small club, but a real fucking boss sort of sound system. And you'd sit there going, a fucking train just went past through the middle of French Kiss, and you go, wow. And it was, they were pretty mad, those clubs, and it was like, we were very lucky to have a little insight into some of those clubs at that time,
Because I saw him DJ at the Hacienda probably around 1990, and it was one of the, his set completely blew me away. He did all of that, he had lots of effects going on, and he played some crazy sort of Glenn Miller jazz band thing at the end, which was absolutely insane. You know, he was doing things that other DJs really, really weren't doing. But those, it's. I think that. So, which clubs was it you were going to?
I can't remember, to be quite. I wouldn't have a clue. They were just clubs. You know, Marshall didn't go out very often.
He kind of prefers to play computer games, doesn't he?
He doesn't go out. Oh yeah, Marshall's mad as fuck. Marshall wouldn't go out apart from a couple of Saturday nights. We go, come on, Marshall, we got to go out. So he'd hire the stretch limo and we'd just cruise around Chicago and go to clubs with Marshall.
In a limo?
Yeah, we had to full. Yeah, well, we actually did a video. We went back and filmed when we did Hypnotize. We went back to Chicago and we shot a video in Chicago, and we got everybody in it. Yeah, it was loads of fun. We kind of documented that at that point. But obviously they were doing really well by that time. Yeah.
So you made an album with them. Have you got something you can play us from that record?
I've got some stuff on vinyl, I think. Hang on. Do you want, I'll tell you what. I'll play Hypnotize. It was kind of a bit more commercial by this time, actually. But let's have a look. I'll play Gerald's mix, actually. This had got 10 City on it. I think it got Kim on it as well. I'm not sure, but this is one that Marshall did. But it was an interesting kind of thing because we were doing a lot of work with Robert Gordon and Mark Bryden, who was Robert Gordon's Forge Masters, who was on Warp, Mark Bryden's Moloko. And we did a lot of recording with them, do some of the vocals over in England, and we had 10 City working with us. A lot of it was, strangely enough, a lot of the vocals we did with 10 City, we did in England, we did in Sheffield. And we mixed it there, and then we went back to Chicago. So it was done in a kind of strange piecemeal way.
And so the mix you're talking about is a Gerald mix?
This is a guy called Gerald mix, yeah. And I haven't heard this for ages, so let's have a listen. This will be nice for me.
You just said to me, it's Byron Steely's vocals, all fucked up. Is this the link between kind of, what you were doing in the 70s and what you were doing then?
I don't. Interestingly enough, I suppose the stuff that Gerald was doing then and we were doing, it's acceptable now. I don't know if the stuff we were doing in the 70s is ever going to be acceptable, but at that moment in time, no one. That was, in fact, I think that was the first mix Gerald had ever done of anyone.
Really?
Yeah, that's the first mix he'd done. He'd just done Voodoo Ray and he'd just done Pacific State, and he'd just left 808 State, and we were actually, because we toured quite a lot with Gerald. Gerald used to come and he was great. I mean, he was just a friend, and he toured with us for quite a long time.
Greg Wilson had a funny story about him saying that he used to go to Legends when he was 15 and used to kind of get dressed up in a trench coat to try and look older than he really was to get in. And I don't quite know why a trench coat would make you look older, but I like this idea of a guy called Gerald, rifling through his kind of parents'
I'd like
cupboard
to
find a trench coat. So what was obviously a guy called Gerald did loads of amazing music and he's still doing stuff now. What was it about his style that you liked?
I just thought he was making a really interesting English kind of take on that type of music at that moment in time. And Voodoo Ray is one of the all-time classics, and it was just around the time he'd done that he did that for us. And it was great. Like I say, we used to play. He used to jam and do on stage and do again sort of 20-minute versions of Voodoo Ray and stuff. And I just liked the way he was just a great guy, and I liked the music he was doing. So yeah,
So did you just say he toured with you?
Yeah, he played quite a lot with us at that time.
And so what, he'd be DJing?
No, he played live. He had a singer, and it was him. In fact, he had two singers and him, just using a little microprocessor and sort of playing along. Yeah.
Yeah, Gerald, he rocks. So, let's kind of take it forwards a bit. After this, let's kind of fast forward through the 90s, and you moved. When did you move to Perth?
I moved over to Perth in the kind of mid-90s, so 95, I think, 95, 96. I moved over there. So After that album, we'd amassed such a debt at EMI, they kicked us off the label, because we'd left Virgin and we'd gone to EMI. And we were quite happy to go to EMI, but we kind of made sure we did it on our terms, and we just said, if we sign to the label, we kind of have complete control of who we work with. And we did, so we did an album with Marshall, we did an album with Adrian Sherwood, Derek May remixed us, Gerald, or whoever did it. And we never made any money, and so they just told us to fuck off eventually, which is, you know, the way the industry works. But we didn't mind. But we felt at least we'd made good use of our money at that moment in time. So we set up our own label then after that, did Plastex, and did 3 albums for our own label after we left EMI in the early 90s.
I mean, you just said you kind of went to EMI on the basis that you had complete control over who you work with. Have you got any tips for people here who might be inking deals with record labels about how best to ensure control of your work?
I think really you've just got to be smart. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think the thing is now that there's so many buffers between yourself and the public, there's so many ways of actually getting your music out there that I don't know. I think record companies or major labels are probably wondering how they can deal with music that's out there. I think you're in a stronger position in, you know, thinking about how you want people to access your music. Now, the platforms and the means of accessing music require major labels, you know, probably less and less in some ways, unless, of course, you are a commercial act, and then in that case you're going to deal with them in your own terms anyway. So.
I mean, we've established that the avant-garde route is never going to make you a lot of money. Why I mean, obviously money isn't what it's about, but why have you sort of stuck so strongly to that aesthetic? What is it that appeals to you about it?
Oh, I think you've got to live with yourself. You've got to make music that it reflects you as a person, as a personality. And if people, you know, I mean, I grew up with popular music. I don't have a problem with it. It's not an issue with me. But it's not what A, I was capable of making, or B, particularly wanted to make. And I mean, to be quite honest with you, that's the reason I eventually came to Australia, because we were having to make albums purely to pay the rent and to eat, which is fine, which was all right, but then I had this thing whereby I just didn't want to make music. I didn't even feel like I wanted to make music in those terms. I just wanted to make music purely if I wanted to do it myself and not feel as though it was a career. And after making music and it having been a career for, you know, 20 years or whatever, more than 20 years, I was quite happy to go. I don't want to have those commercial or financial pressures put upon me, because I felt it wasn't the reason I started making music. So that's why I went back to that.
And so, what did you start doing when you came to Perth?
I started making music. I've done bits of studying over here, and I'm kind of writing at the moment doing that. And I set up Offworld with the label Offworld Sounds, which it was I suppose it was probably indicative of how not the market, but the music, the music culture existed at this moment in time, and how it's changed. I mean, we brought out, I think Offworld's had 15, 16, whatever, maybe more releases, about half a dozen pieces of vinyl. But we don't sell anything, you know. That reflects probably the infrastructure in Australia, and the fact that I live in Perth and it's miles away. So it makes it difficult in Australia to operate under those terms. But also the way that the whole music culture's changed. And obviously now, you know, you think about when we're just doing the new album, you just go, well, do I even want to release it as a CD? Is it just downloads? Do I just let people have it?
So can you play us something from the label, or something that shows kind of
yeah, what do you want to hear? Happening? I can play. Hey, I'll tell you what, I'll play Sassy and Loco, which is the stuff that I did, and I think it sold a vast total of about 300 copies. So there you go. Don't do a label, guys. Let's have a look. And I've no idea. I'll just play it because I don't know what's on here.
So what's kind of like what's driving you musically now then?
Well, that was just Sassy and Loco. That was just stuff I did, just my stuff that I did a couple of years ago. I'm still doing the Cooling Brothers because I kind of enjoy the social, interactive and cooperative thing about doing music. So I mean, and Coolings has always been a bit like that. I mean, it's chiefly myself and a guy called Shane Norton who did Sound Lab, and our guitarist Jack. But I mean, there's been times when we've played, you know, with about 11 people on stage, and sometimes just 2 people. So it's kind of this. I suppose it's just an act that's a work in progress, and it kind of. I suppose we change the sort of the way we perform or the way we present it with the change in circumstances, but. Musically, I don't know. I mean, I'm still. You just fuck around, and you know, music's still a matter of juxtaposing sort of sounds and rhythms, and actually seeing what operates for you. And the fact that I like the Coolings purely because it's an input from a number of people, and I enjoy that now. I don't particularly. I'm not that bothered about kind of going, this is the world according to Mal. I kind of quite like the social aspects, and I'm involved in other things, so music can then become just something that I enjoy doing, so I just do that.
So if you think about the stuff that you were doing kind of in the beginning and that you and your peers were doing, what do you think what have you bequeathed today? What's the kind of biggest impact of what you did then on music, or what's possible today?
Well, I mean, it's kind of arrogant to sort of say, I think this is what we gave to music, or what I gave to music. So I really, it's in other people's hands to see, to sort of really attest to that. But I suppose we were part of that process of democratizing music. We were part of that process of saying, you know, you can do it yourself. You don't need to have that level of proficiency. You don't need to go into a studio and spend thousands of dollars. If you want to make music, if you do have ideas, we were continually pushing for people to actually take control of that process of making music, of actually getting it out there, and really sort of following the whole thing through. So you know, the independent labels, people developing. I mean, that's what we did. When we got an advance from a record label, we didn't go and spend it in the studio. Most of the time, we just used it to increase our own studio. So we went from a 4-track to an 8-track to a 16-track to a 16-track studio. We just kept reinvesting our money. But obviously now, that was an analog period. Now it's a digital age, and so therefore, you know, the whole process has been democratized. So I guess we're just part of that, really.
So I guess like maybe the key point is, you don't have to have like the shiniest, glossiest, flashiest studio. You just need like an attic full of tape machines. Yeah,
and I suppose the other thing as well is that everything is valid within the context of music anyway. Probably the other thing we did, we were one of the first people to sort of, well, not the first, again, that's arrogant, but, you know, sort of integrate found sounds, use TV sounds, spoken word, things like that. So basically kind of integrate your environment, and particularly your media environment, into the music and the sounds you make, and it was just a reflection of us, you know. If we heard it on TV, it was just as valid as a vocal or a keyboard to us, so we kind of made sure we integrated those in there.
So guys like Herbert, who were sampling packets of crisps and, you know, dropping spoons.
Yeah, God bless him, good old Matt, yeah.
Absolutely, but, you know, sort of 20 years before that, you were smashing up pianos and using those sounds. And
we're all part of that whole chronology, you know. Matthew's obviously doing it in his own way, we did it in our way, you know. John Cage, Brian Eno, they're all part of it. I wouldn't lay claim to any of those things. I think it's just that everybody puts together their own version of the musical world they want to create, and that was ours. But ours has never been purely limited to music in that sense. We use sound. Sound is as interesting to us as music.
I mean, I know that obviously you're still involved in music and you're still making music and you've got your label and radio stuff and all this thing. But if you detach yourself for a minute as a kind of consumer and fan of music, and you take the long view, what pleases you about music in 2006?
I think what I find interesting about music in 2006, that 2006 doesn't exist. Time is irrelevant, you know, like Eno said, you know, as soon as music became recorded, then time ceased to exist. Space is the only kind of parameter. And now, probably because of communication, space doesn't really exist anymore. So here and now in 2006 are irrelevant. We can make whatever space we're in, we can create it from any time and from any space. So it's kind of the morphing of time and space. You know, everything is accessible now. I'm not saying it's the end of history, like people say, but it is interesting how that is all there, you know. Sort of so the music that we all buy, you know, we're looking for new sounds, etc., but it may exist from something that's 30, 40 years old, but it also may be something that, you know, Scream made last week. So I find that fascinating. I find that really fascinating.
So what sort of music, what sort of artists are you feeling?
Again, it's really hard because, I mean, I could probably go, oh, God, everything from 0 dB to an old soul track that I probably bought or whatever. So it's not something that I, you know, would say the newest thing is what I'm listening to. I don't have it. I kind of don't have any real parameters like that anymore.
So that's a living embodiment of the interesting thing about today, being that the sort of the gap between old and new has been broken down. So it doesn't really matter whether something is old or new or cool or not cool or rave or soul. It's all in front of us, isn't it? It's
all happening now, and it always will. It'll continue to happen, you know.
And kind of maintaining this sort of vantage point of looking at what's happening now. What disappoints you about music now?
Well, I've stopped DJing because I'm fucking pissed off with people who've now grown up. I was talking about this to Lorna the other day, yesterday, and Mark Pritchard. iPod culture has now meant that people, because of what we were just talking about, kind of want to hear things as they see them. So almost like DJing has become almost irrelevant. They just want to hear what's in their head at that moment in time. And I got really bored of DJing, so I don't really DJ anymore. That's probably my experiences in Perth, so I don't bother doing it. I mean, I still play occasionally, but I think that's probably everybody thinks they know everything. And in that sense, people are closing their ears and closing their eyes, and I don't think you should do that. I think if somebody is playing a piece of music and people are making a piece of music, you should fucking pay respect and listen to it and not go, excuse me, can you play this, or can I listen to that? I think the danger is people, and that is one of the problems, is we are the generation that looks down. We've atomized our lives. It's part of technology, it's part of the digital kind of world we live in, but we've atomized our musical experiences. We brought it in completely to ourselves. I'm more interested really in breaking that and more into a social mould. The social part of the way we hear music should be really encouraged a lot more, rather than, you know, a Generation Y closed, looking down, atomized existence.
So you're basically saying, kids, take out your iPod earbuds and go to a club.
Yeah.
And hear some music there. So you're hearing music as a shared experience rather than just your own personal soundtrack.
Yeah, I'm pissed off. We're sitting in the car and I'm talking to my kids, and after 5 minutes they haven't responded because they're both listening to completely different tracks on their iPods and MP3 players. And you just go, well, that was a waste of time, wasn't it? So, but it's cool. It means I can listen to the stereo in the car and they don't bug me, so it's cool.
Okay then, so to finish up, what's next for you? What's happening?
Just doing a new Cooling Brothers album. And there was a few things I was still going to play because we did the Shaun Ryder album. I never got a chance to play a bit of that. But I'm just doing that. I mean, at the moment I'm writing, so I've just got about 10 months left of my doctorate to do, so I'm writing on that. So I've kind of shifted a little bit to writing about sound as much as listening to sound. So that's where I'm at the moment. So I'm kind of doing that. But music's still important, and I get really irritable if we don't go and make music, so I'll make sure I kind of get a day a week in the studio. And that's my musical kind of contribution, and it's just for me really more than anything else. But yeah, new Cooling's album, and it should be finished by the end of the year, and it's taken about 18 months to do. So that's what I'm doing, yeah.
Well, have we got any questions from anyone here? Aha. We're using this one mic.
Hello.
My question is, it has something to do with Chicago producers and this strange connection between America and Europe. You said that you actually, you and another other group members, you left for Chicago in 80s, no?
Mm-hmm.
To check some sounds or whatever. And this is really interesting because Bob Perry that you mentioned, yes, but it was totally unknown in America for some time, and actually his music technology was very simple. This was like something out in West Coast songs like Bandana or whatever, he had no, and actually he was inspired by a European sound, like from James Theology, like from, you know, music by Tactile, Belgian groups or whatever. And you're telling that he was interested in Chicago sounds and in the music sounds or the Detroit sound that was so primitive in a way. So I was actually quite interested. Why and what made you decide to go and check US scene? What kind of sounding you were attracted by? And you know, it's really strange to understand actually who was interested by who.
Well, I mean, interest. That's what I write. That's what I've been writing about. I mean, it's alterity. We're always interested in the other. We're interested in otherness. So what we aren't fascinates us. So therefore, you know, that's why Kraftwerk were. That was so important to the electro scene in New York because it wasn't sort of produced within that scene. We're always fascinated by the things that we don't produce. You know, that's the interesting thing. So that's the way it goes. I mean, I was shocked when I got to Chicago to find out, you know, Marshall Jefferson's a massive Led Zeppelin fan. You know, so I was kind of quite surprised by that because I'm not, but I mean he was. So it's just I think it's always we're always interested in the things that we don't make ourselves. You know, we're fascinated by the music cultures.
But also that music was being played in clubs in England, you know, massively. So it was around. If you were interested in music and you're interested in dance floor culture, you'd be exposed to that music. So it was kind of very much in your territory, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was probably getting more exposure in England than it was over there. I mean, if you speak to Derek, you know, Derek Mayo, you speak to any of those guys, I mean, that's why they wanted to go to England, because they were more appreciated over there. But, you know, that was just the way things were in England and in Europe at that moment in time. Maybe ecstasy had got a lot to do with it, I don't know, but whatever happens, it was part of that thing, yeah.
Because of that time in Detroit, for example, Jeff Mills was listening to that Electrifying Mojo, legendary radio DJ, and he was playing
Depeche Mode and things like that, yeah.
Well, yeah, like Genesis P. Orridge from Throbbing Crystal, and some of your musics, and, you know, Holger Shukai from Ken. So, and now you are you were interested in that raw sound.
But there was a kind of reciprocal agreement, because even though those two scenes hadn't connected at that point, people in England were jacking to Chicago house music as part of England's own sort of background of black music, and they were doing the same thing with European music. But maybe that's what you're talking about being interested in the other. So we liked,
but
we had that music in England, and they had something of ours, and when the two things came together, a whole new area of music could explode.
But you also have to understand that kind of club cultures are more embedded, particularly in Britain, a lot more embedded than they are in America. They're a lot more circumscribed in America, because, like I said, we go to clubs in Chicago, and it was very specific, the type of people, you know, it wasn't a broad base, whereas in Britain what you've got is a really embedded kind of disc culture, because jazz, northern soul, funk were really kind of very popular, so it's just a continuation of that kind of cultural thing. That's why it worked in Britain, because it had a club culture that was very, you know, kind of quite extensive, and particularly been going on jazz in the 30s, but particularly after the Second World War, soul, etc., and reggae were very well embedded into British popular culture, and that's why it worked over there, really.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, we've got a Blondertron hand, I see.
Hi, thanks very much. I was just wondering, I just thought it was really interesting how, like, the progression of using noise and sounds to what you have now. Can you talk a little bit about your creative process now and, like, where you're getting your sounds from? Are you still using, like, abstract kind of sources, or?
Yeah, I mean, to be quite honest, the sources are probably not that different. It's just the processing that's different, really.
Like,
I mean,
really destroying
stuff. It's a lot easier to sort of really utilize sounds, chop them up and mash things up in Pro Tools or in Logic than it was when you were just using tape machines. So it allows a more sophisticated process. But yeah, at the same time, you know, the sounds that we're using are probably not radically different. You know, I just used on the first Coolings album, you know, used a tap dancing solo from a 1930s jazz film and sort of environmental noises. And that's probably what I would have done, we would have done in the 70s and 80s. But the thing is, you can get it to sync up, which is probably the only difference. It's the technology that we now have really has an impact on the way we use those sounds. That's the only difference, really.
Anything else? Got some Andy over here.
I remember you were saying that earlier in your career, you were doing things that people weren't doing at the time and you weren't really accepted, really. How did you deal with, if it came up for you though, any kind of insecurities with your work and things like that? How did you deal with that?
We didn't really have insecurities because I think, particularly, maybe if you're a solo artist, it's probably a little bit harder, but when you're a band, you kind of have that collective consensus sort of belief in what you do, so you get that mutual support. So it didn't really worry us. And also, in some ways, any reaction was a good reaction. So we didn't see a negative in anything. You know, we were trying to be transgressive in those early periods, so therefore a reaction was good. No reaction would have meant we weren't actually achieving anything. So we didn't mind if people sort of responded in what they saw as a negative way, because we took heart in that anyway. It was like, well, it works because we're trying to really affect people and make some kind of impact there. So it did, whatever way we saw it, it was working. And when there's two or three of you in the group, you're equal. You know, you're able to go, well, that's fine, that's cool. We think it's okay. You know, as long as we think it's okay, then that's cool.
And did I see someone else? Any other questions? Or are we done? And Nina, is that another one? There you go.
Just one more. And you, Emma, you mentioned a question like, how do you see your contribution to the world scene or whatever? So my personal opinion is, whatever you have contributed to the musical scene, but you've got the most stylish covers for your. That's just, you know, that's one of this Trobon Crystal Cabaret Voltaire is one of the most stylish, and you know, if you're, I mean. Many designers and fashion people, they've used it so many times. So at least in this area, you've contributed a lot.
Well, that's nice. We were. I mean, obviously packaging, and I mean, that's the thing. When we did make music, like I said, even in the early stages, we also used to make our own films. We'd make Super 8 stuff. We'd do all that. We were very involved in that side because we felt the visual representation of us was just as important as, or it was important to support the sounds that we were doing. So we took a lot of sort of consideration in what we were doing, and it was lucky because, again, I mean, probably around the time it would have been really early 80s, a guy came to one of our gigs and he said, I'd really like to. He goes, he was a student at the London School of Printing, and he said, I love the music, can I design a sleeve for you? And we went, will you do it for free? And he went, yeah, all right. And that was Neville Brody who designed the face. And, you know, Nev and I became great friends. So we were lucky that we had those things, you know. It's just, I guess it was just that right moment. You know, music is chance and causality. A lot of things you kind of intend to happen. Some things are pure accident. And meeting Neville at a gig was one of those things. Again, Piggy Anderson, Designers Republic, I mean, they'd never done anything. You know, when we knew Ian, he was in a band, and he just, he said, you know, can we, you know, can do a sleeve, and they're just mates from Sheffield, and that's Designers Republic who do all the warp and everything. So we were lucky. We didn't actually have to go, oh, can you design stuff for us? We just had people who were really cool, and we were really lucky to get the benefit, you know, to benefit from their kind of contribution. So yeah. We were lucky like that.
That's kind of point 2 in the masterclass, maximise your hookups.
Yeah, be very careful though, because it doesn't always work. Sometimes, like I say, some things are kind of a chance thing. I mean, Pete Saville, when we did the first Factory record, wanted to design our sleeves, and we said no, we didn't really like his stuff. So that's we weren't that bothered. We went, no, actually Mal's doing it. I did the next sleeve. So how crap is that? I turned down Pete Saville and did it myself with a bit of letter set. So that was pretty shit, wasn't it? But I'm sure, you know, Pete Saville's, you know, a great guy. So it does work. You know, these things happen. Sonic Youth, when we ran Double Vision, our label in England, Sonic Youth wanted to sign to the label, and we went, nah, I don't think so. You know, and you go, oh, that's really shit, really. We should probably done that, shouldn't we?
Well, I suppose, you know, these things happen, don't they? And,
No, I mean...
it's kind of like these good chance things happen, but also bad chance too.
Yeah, and plus, you know, you like I say, you do the things that are comfortable for you and feel right, you know, for you. So that's the way it works. You should know yourself better than anyone, so you just do that.
Okay, then. So, if there are there any more questions? Okay.
Your early stuff, particularly, probably had a pretty big influence on the California hardcore scene. Did you ever get into any of those records, or
So in what? In
like
what?
a California hardcore sort of scene?
Not particularly, no. It was just, like I say, it wasn't something that we really sort of considered, no. It was just, I guess it was just one of those things. You mean the kind of heaviest stuff that came out of there?
Yeah, Black Flag,
Yeah.
suicidal tendencies.
Yeah, I mean, no, not really. I mean, bands, some of the Canadian stuff like Skinny Puppy and all those things were influenced. But strangely enough, we found that a little bit to what people called industrial. And I suppose at that time we were like, well, no, because we're kind of more into Grandmaster Flash and this kind of stuff at that time. So they were kind of going that way. And so we weren't very good at being we never had those rock influences in us, despite playing Nag Nag Nag.
Yeah,
we never really had many rock influences. It was the one thing we weren't into. You know, it was the thing that didn't work for us. You know, for me, the ultimate rock band is Public Image. You know, and they were about the destruction of that rock kind of iconography. So. No, I didn't. I respect him, and that's really cool, and that's great. And you know, at one point we were going to do some stuff for Sub Pop, and I respect all that, but it wasn't really us. You know.
For sure.
Okay, then. Well, I think that's it. So, Steve and Amanda would like to say thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.